Good evening. My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a monthly town meeting that brings prominent New Yorkers together with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowsky Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. New York leads the nation in so many things. One we are not quite so proud of was a report by the Brennan Center for Justice at the NYU Law School that found New York has the most dysfunctional legislature in the nation. The archetype of three men in a room, the governor, the state Senate majority leader, and the speaker of the state assembly, has been viewed as one of the major blocks to effective consideration and passage of measures as basic as the state budget, which has not been adopted on time in 2 decades. Perhaps one of the things that the legislature is best at is self-preservation, as evidenced by the fact that the same 18.5 million people can be divided up creatively enough to create a small majority for Republicans in the Senate and an overwhelming majority for Democrats in the Assembly. Minority members in each chamber have gotten so frustrated that they have actually sued their own leaders, along with Governor Pataki, arguing that the three men so unfairly and illegally control power and money that their districts wind up paying the price in terms of fewer projects. But the winds of reform are being felt in Albany. Legislative rules are being slowly changed to introduce more accountability and transparency in how lawmakers go about their business. Does it matter to the average New Yorker whether their legislators have more say in what goes on in the Capitol? And if it does matter, do they care enough to hold their own legislator accountable for the fate of reform efforts? We are joined tonight by 2 legislators and a reform advocate to discuss the state of legislative reform. Assemblyman Richard Gottfried of Manhattan is a veteran lawmaker who has risen near the top of the leadership during a career of more than 3 decades, currently chairing the Health Committee. Daniel O'Donnell is in his 2nd term in the legislature, emerging as an effective voice for reform. And Rachel Leon is the director of Common Cause New York, a reformist group that has worked at Albany and the city to increase transparency and accountability in government. Assemblyman Gottfried, let me start with you. You've been there a long time. You were first elected in 1970, and you're only 28 years old, which is an interesting idea. You felt these
talk about lack of transparency.
Right. I mean, you've been a young member who was kind of frustrated at the kind of hidebound way of the legislature. Now you're in a position of leadership. How has it changed? How do you assess this idea of trying to open up the legislature?
Well, one of the most important things that changed was that we got a Democratic majority in the Assembly, not a Republican majority. Also, when the Democratic majority came in 30 years ago, we enacted some major rules changes that the public has not heard much about, but which dramatically changed the way the legislature operated, or at least the way the Assembly operated, and which the Senate to this day has still not adopted. The right of the sponsor of a bill to have a vote in a committee, the fact that every bill in the Assembly must be approved by a substantive standing committee, not by the Rules Committee, in order for it to go anywhere. The fact that you have to be present at a committee meeting in order to vote at that meeting. We don't have proxy voting in Assembly committees. Also, in 1975, the distribution of the Assembly's internal resources was changed dramatically to provide much more staffing and other resources to rank and file Assembly members, where previously it had all been doled out not only to very senior members but to mainly to the New York City party county leaders. So we had a major sea change in the legislature 30 years ago. If the popular perception of the legislature that Danny O'Donnell and I and our colleagues were all just sitting in the peanut gallery booing or applauding on cue while the 2 legislative leaders and the governor worked everything out, if that model bore any resemblance to my workplace, I would have left and found something else to do probably about 30 years ago. Fortunately, that is not how the legislature works.
I think it's also true, if I remember correctly, that 30 years ago that there actually was no staff and no money for an office for a legislator, and a lot of those legislative offices actually were done through political clubs and district leaders and stuff. There was a point at which there wasn't even...
Legislators did not have district offices. There was plenty of staff being hired. They didn't work for the legislature. They worked for local political organizations, and frequently the legislators had no clue who was on the legislative staff.
Danny, you've been there since the year 2002, 2003. Has it been a frustrating experience? Have you had to figure out leverage points to get your views across?
Well, like most everything in life, charm goes a long way, Bob. So if you have a little bit of charm, you can find a way to be effective. I think the question from a reform perspective is whether or not some of those decision making occurs in a way that people can understand what they are. And so some of the things that Dick just mentioned that were reforms in 1974, they're all very true. That is the way we run, and many of those things your ordinary citizenry doesn't know that we do. But the reform movement that people propelled to the front in this year, and I was one of those people involved in that propelling, had to do with some of the other issues that still remain unresolved. I mean, it's better now than it was last year in the sense that if an individual citizen came to me and said, hey, what happened with this bill? It's easier now to say this is what happened to this bill because of the ways in which some of the committee rules have changed. But some of the problems that exist still exist. And in the end, from my perspective, the ultimate problems, really have to do with the access of money in politics and the way in which, money plays a certain kind of game. And so that is true currently in Albany. That was true last year. And the reality is that in the Assembly, we all represent approximately 125,000 people. But the amount of resources we get from the Speaker to run our offices, to write constituent letters, to write bills is hugely different based on seniority. And that was one of the things that was also mentioned in the Brennan Center report was why do the 120,000 people who I represent only get 2 employees in my office when somebody else who has been there for a long time has 30 or something like that. I mean, there is a huge disparity, and some of those disparities reflect a lot of different problems. And so in my community where I represent, you live in it, Bob, so
Yes, I do.
That people come to me for a variety of things. And they say, I didn't get my Social Security check, or something happened, or the street lamp is broken. I mean, everything from the most basic city services to very, very complicated issues. We all want to be able to provide the best service we can to our constituents. We all need to be able to do that. And there's also huge disparities based on where you are around the state. If you take the same paycheck in New York City and say to somebody fresh out of college, here's a paycheck, live on the salary in New York City, that can't happen. You give that paycheck to someone in Utica or Rome, they can buy the nicest house in Utica and Rome on that paycheck. And so there's a lot of ways in which the distribution of what we do is not equal. I've not found it particularly frustrating in that I have found a way to find issues that matter to me and matter to my constituents and make sure that my voice is heard on those issues.
Rachel, you've been looking at these kinds of reform issues and been involved in them. Give me a sense of the agenda of reform that's going on up in Albany.
Sure. Well, Common Cause has been fighting for reform for 30 years. And in the beginning, some of our early victories, at the state level were the freedom of information laws and getting more sunshine into government. But our overall goal is just to have a more robust democracy. So I think you'll always find talented assembly people and senators who can get in there and get a good job done, irregardless of the system. But I think there's no question that we do need to fix Albany, and we need to do it in several ways. And it's true, changing the rules on how we conduct ourselves and how the legislature conducts itself is only one piece of the equation. So I think right now our agenda, we have a 10-point plan to fix Albany, and it includes, number 1, redistricting, which you mentioned in your opening. I mean, right now our lawmakers choose their districts rather than voters choosing their lawmakers. And so we would like to see a redistricting system that was done by a nonpartisan panel and sort of take the politics out of it, like we've seen in some other states. We believe campaign finance reform is crucial. I mean, right now, money in politics is a huge part of what's happening, at the state level. We need election reform. We do need rules reform, and I think the Assembly has made a serious start to it. The Senate is a much weaker beginning, but if 30 years ago there were major rules reforms, obviously we need to take another look at them and see what we can do today. One of the things we really push for is a CSpan, so that like a forum like this, New Yorkers could actually see what happens, because I think it's true that 3 men in a room do dominate Albany, or 3 men not in a room, or 5 men in a room now. We've had some progress already this session. Now the meetings are open to the public, and they include the leaders of the minority in both houses, as well as the other 3 leaders.
They are still all men, though.
They are still all men. It says it's a public meeting. They at first weren't going to let us in. They had said there was going to be a public leaders meeting, and then the state police said that was only meant for press. And I was like, since when did public mean press only? So we fought, we got let in. We're not obviously allowed to speak, you just listen. And but anyway, I think even a small change like that is helpful. Like this week, one of the things that happened with those 5 people being in a room and on camera is that they agreed to let the comptroller, if they can't come to an agreement between the Senate and the Assembly and the governor, the comptroller will set the revenue forecast for this year. So that brings us to another one of our points, budget reform, which is obviously crucial. So I mean, I think the bottom line is people don't get frustrated with the process until it disrupts the substance and what you get at the end. And I think we've gotten to a point in Albany where, bad process has led to paralysis, like last year where we had the latest budget ever. We didn't deal with school reform. At that point, we hadn't done Rockefeller drug laws. We hadn't done minimum wage. We got almost nothing done last year in the legislative session. There was a lot of rancor. And so I think that's the feeling where, how do we make this process better so that we can also get real substance done?
I want to talk about a particular issue, the death penalty, and the way it relates to reform. But something that perked my ears up is the idea of the relationship between politics and government. And I think it's, and maybe I'm just kind of an old-fashioned person. I think it's naive to think you're going to take politics out of government, and I don't think it's a good idea to take politics out of government. I mean, it's the control of politics. I mean, you're an elected official. You are a politician. I don't view that as a negative word. Mm-hmm. I mean, is there this kind of, what's the implications of a disconnect between politics and government?
It's, I don't know that any human society has ever been run by a government that wasn't involved with politics. There are questions of who controls the politics. I mean, in a dictatorship, the dictator presumably controls the politics. So there always will be politics in government. It's almost the same word.
I mean, even partisan politics. I mean, even if you look at it as partisan politics, as the role of parties in government. I mean, to some degree, the reformers are concerned about the implications.
Specifically in redistricting, if you take when you have politicians writing, and agreeing with each other to draw their own lines to get reelected, that's what I would call too much partisan politics in government.
Do you have a thought on?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting problem. I mean, we as a conference, the Democrats all meet every day, and we talk about where things are and how to move forward and so on and so forth. That is obviously partisan. That's not open to the public, and then Republicans aren't invited to our strategy sessions. If you're suggesting we should run government without strategy, I don't think that that's really a very good idea, nor do I think that will be an effective mechanism. I mean, obviously, some reform groups, when I first ran for office, would ask me, would I support putting cameras in the conference room so they can watch us have these private conversations? And I said no, because eventually the private conversations need to take place. Somebody needs to say, this is the line for my constituents or for me. This is the line that must not be crossed in whatever the compromise may be. And we need to sort of hear that from each other to be able to know what that is. That doesn't mean that the partisan level of it needs to drive everything. And obviously, with redistricting, that's a very good issue. If you look at Texas and Tom DeLay, you learn what the power is when people with too much power get to decide what the districts are. I don't, at the current time, think that the district lines in the Assembly are so egregious. If you look at them, now they could be drawn somewhat differently. They're not that egregious. Some of the Senate districts are absolutely outrageous, where you find people of color or people who are poor, divided up into 4 separate districts to guarantee that there's no opportunity for some other voice to be heard. That is when the partisan politics crosses the line from allowing effective government, which is having private conversations so people know where you stand, to having ineffective government, which is intended to shut people out.
It was precisely that Democratic caucus where the death penalty debate emerged from, where, last June, the Court of Appeals overturned the death penalty, found it unconstitutional. And the way I understand it is, and I'm a lobbyist for New Yorkers against the death penalty. Let me lay my
conflict of interest.
Well, I lay my conflicts of interest
And you're
out.
probably not going to get a
good.
very heated debate. No, I'm not pro and con on the
I
death
will
penalty.
always try to lay my conflicts out. This is part of the openness and transparency
Right.
we're talking about. And it was the governor proposed a fix, and the state Senate said, okay, we'll go along with it. And the Assembly did something very radical that didn't happen 10 years ago when the death penalty was passed. I think it was you, Danny, were one of the people who stood up in the conference and said, I never got to vote on this. There was a move in the Assembly to just reauthorize the death penalty, and a number of lawmakers said, stop.
By the way,
let's have hearings.
If the legislature were really run by 3 men in a room, then probably within a couple of weeks after the Court of Appeals decision that effectively suspended the death penalty in this state, within weeks of that decision, a bill would have become law restoring the death penalty.
But isn't it precisely the reform impulse that is in play in these death penalty hearings?
Well, I think it is the fact that the Assembly at that time was not run by 3 men in a room or by 1 man that ground that process to a halt. And it was because of that fact that rank and file members of the Assembly stood up, and Danny was one of the major ones among them, who said, no, this is wrong. We shouldn't be doing this. Times have changed. There's been a dramatic shift in the membership of the legislature in the last 10 years, with and without redistricting. And the people's attitudes have changed, and we shouldn't just blindly go ahead and do this. Out of that discussion came not only the grinding of the issue to a halt while people thought about it, but then an extraordinary series of hearings, in the course of which I think minds of legislators have in fact been changed.
Which we think, we do think this is an example of sort of reform at its best, or just democracy at its best, in the sense that there have been a number of public hearings. People's voices really have been heard on this issue. And it is striking to read, it's in the Times-Union in an upstate paper today, that members have changed their mind based on evidence, based on, debate and public hearings. So that's the kind of thing we want to see on, more issues. And I think where the public was getting frustrated, and certainly where reformers were frustrated, there's so many issues that never get addressed, primarily because of the paralysis that's come around budget reform. It used to be, as a lobbyist, and I'm a lobbyist too at Common Cause, and we lobby on reform issues, but I used to be a lobbyist on hunger and welfare issues, and it used to be you had to wait out the budget, and nothing happened until the budget was done, and the budget would be a couple weeks late. But then you'd have May and June to fight out your issues. You'd have at least 1 month to try to get some good legislation passed or to stop some bad legislation on an issue like hunger. Now it's the budget all the way into the summer, and unless it's connected to the budget, nothing really gets done. So I think that's one of the frustrating things.
Jenny, to what degree was the reform, this kind of confluence of factors pushing reform, instrumental in pushing this death penalty debate?
Well, it's interesting because when you watch TV news, and if there is a junta in a third world nation, where do the tanks go? They go to the newspapers.
The radio station.
And the radio stations. He who controls the information controls the outcome. And so anytime government is capable of gathering more information to allow people to learn about what the issue is, whatever that is a good thing. Those death penalty hearings have lasted 5 days. Some of them have gone till 7 o'clock at night. I've sat through almost all of them, hours and hours and hours and hours of them. And in each kernel, there's a kernel of wisdom in everyone's testimony about wherever they come from on either side of the debate. The old Albany way, which was, let's just fix this. It's 2 o'clock in the morning, wink, wink, nod, nod, shake hands, we're going to fix this. And that was not permitted to happen on the subject for, I think, only the most noble of reasons. When that began, and I was one of the people who called for those hearings very strongly, I didn't know what we would learn. I didn't know that 90% of the people testifying would be testifying against. I didn't know that we would learn about the racial bias and I didn't know any of that. But I did know that any information that we gathered would be useful for us in determining either that we need to restore the death penalty because that's the will of the people, or if it's not, that we need to finally put an end to it. And so when subjects like that, which are very hot button and people have very strong opinions, it is better to open up the process and allow people to do it. Unfortunately, it makes you have to work a little harder because as an assembly member, I could be staying in my office and doing other things and writing letters and whatever else it is. If you're sitting for 12 hours listening to the testimony of New Yorkers, it takes a lot of time. But in the end, in this process, what we've learned is even individual members like Joe Lenthal and Helene Weinstein, who chair very powerful committees, this process has changed their point of view. And it is entirely possible that the hearings at the end could have been resulted that people who started them, opposed to them, may have changed their mind to be in favor of them. That's not what ended up happening. But in the end, if we don't allow that process and don't encourage that process, then reform doesn't ever mean anything. Because in fact, it's the voters, it's the people who live here who will determine this, not the 150 of us sitting in the legislature.
Dick, you've been an opponent of the death penalty for a long time, I believe.
Since I was about 12.
Right, since you were conscious. You were there in 1995 when the death penalty was passed after the election of Governor Pataki in 1994, who ran basically throw out Mario Cuomo, and we want the death penalty. And there were no hearings in 1995. What's the difference? I mean,
well, first of all,
the difference.
From 1977 through 95, the legislature passed a death penalty bill every year.
And Governor Carey and
Governor Carey, and then Governor Cuomo vetoed it. There were not public hearings, although there was certainly an enormous amount of public discussion back and forth. And every year when we passed the death penalty bill, even though everybody knew what the outcome was going to be, it would pass, the governor would veto it, there wouldn't be enough votes to override. Despite that fact, every year, at least on the Assembly side, there was a lengthy floor debate in which, you know, as some people sometimes say, you know, everything was said, but not everyone has said it yet. In the Assembly death penalty debate, practically everybody spoke at extraordinary length. So there was a whole lot of process about the death penalty from every year from 77 through 95. What changed in 95 was the governor signed the bill instead of vetoing it.
But do you get a sense that this process with bringing the public into an open to a system of open testimony is different, is better, is healthier?
I think you had to have public hearings because unlike 10 or 20 years ago, you don't have a constant, lively public debate about the death penalty at the moment. And I think the hearings were an important way to bring out people's views and discussion on an issue where, without those hearings, you might have just had, you know, the sort of momentum from 10 years before just roll it through. So yeah, I think the hearings made an enormous difference. The hearings happened because individual members of the Assembly stood up and said, no, not on my watch, don't do this. The only thing I would disagree with some of the recent commentary on this is the people who think that individual Assembly members standing up and having an impact on the process, because the New York Times almost never tells people when that happens, we all believe it hasn't happened, because if it isn't in the Times, it hasn't happened. Truth is, it goes on all the time. The New York Times just chooses not to tell anybody about it.
And when I was in Boston at the Democratic Convention, a reporter came up to me and said, okay, tell me the honest truth. Who's at fault in Albany? George Pataki, Joe Bruno, or Shelley Silver? I said, there's a fourth option. And she said, who? I said, the media. I said, you don't cover whether I show up or not. You don't cover whether I vote or not. You don't cover whether or not I write a letter. You don't cover anything. Now, if I was arrested or if I had sex with an intern, you'd cover that. But if I don't do those things, you don't cover it. So how can voters know, you know, when we are all painted with the same brush? We do have colleagues who work harder than others. We do have colleagues who work less than others. If there's no mechanism for the public to know which one of those you are, it's very difficult for reform to actually move forward because it makes no difference.
I think there's, as a reporter for 21 years, I think that it's kind of like what they used to say about Central America during the 1980s, where Americans will do anything for Central America except read about it. And it's the same thing to a degree in Albany. I mean, people don't realize that New York City is a creation of Albany. Albany could vote New York City out of existence tomorrow. So it really is much more of a power nexus over our lives than even what happens in City Hall.
And I agree. I think that, and what we've seen, if you look at it nationally, the amount of ink given to state government has shrunk and shrunk, and the number of reporters in the state houses has shrunk and shrunk. And, you know, I know, you know, editors and writers in Albany who are so frustrated, who are trying to write good stories about the legislative process, and whose editor says, you know, you're not getting any more Albany stories this week. You know, so it is a problem, and, you know, part of it is what the public responds to, unfortunately. But I do think it's true that we don't have enough good coverage of the New York State Legislature. But CSpan could help that, and and both the Assembly and the Senate could help get C-SPAN by actually really moving it forward. And
I guess
so,
it would be
what would we do to do that?
L-SPAN.
well, I think there's a lot of we work on media reform as well as a lot of the other issues. So I think at this point right now, there are cameras in the legislature. So we have come a long way. And the Assembly did.
And there's a media feed.
Yes.
If you had a TV station, you could broadcast
And
it.
I think we may have a TV station in that even PBS now with digital cable is going to have like 6 additional channels. So my guess is we're close, but we need the political will to get there. I can't convince, the cable stations to open up access.
Is it political will, or does somebody in the private sector have to decide to spend money putting it on the air?
Potentially, or
Or should
also,
the taxpayers pay to put it on the air?
Well, I think, first of all, right now, the Assembly and the Senate have their own budgets for their own sort of what we call kind of infomercial TV sets. I'm sure there's good forums that come out of them, but there is money spent each year, hundreds of thousands of dollars, by both houses for their own programming. So that's a good
Congress,
start.
Well, in Congress, C-SPAN is funded in part by license fees, and
Right.
there's
The problem
there is
is
a system
Congress-
through it, right?
What the problem is, it's not a complete easy fix because there are strings attached. National level has more power over.
Well,
or
they control the
should.
licenses.
They should have more power over the broadcasters than at the state level. But that's not to say that New York doesn't do deals all the time with Cablevision and other places. And I think PBS could be a fresh new start. So the first thing, though, that we have not gotten yet is a commitment to say we want to do it. So we need that as a start, and then we'll help you figure out how.
One of the trickier questions in the death penalty debate, as it relates to reform, is I have no doubt that a vast majority of Democrats in the state assembly, in the Democratic caucus, would vote against the death penalty. Mr. Nesbitt, who's the minority leader, the Republican leader of the assembly, thinks that they have 46 votes in favor of the death penalty. Actually, we think they only have 44 votes because there are two assembly members who, for religious reasons, Catholic religious reasons, are opposed to the death penalty. But
Meaning 2 Republicans.
meaning two Republicans who are against the death penalty. Does reform mean that you must have, if you have the caucus opposed to it, that you must bring it to the floor for a vote?
I hope not. I don't think reform means that every bad idea has to be brought to the floor just so there can be a vote on it. I think reform ought to mean that you have an intelligent, informed committee process and an intelligent, informed majority party decision-making process that openly and honestly makes decisions and lets everybody know what those decisions are. But I don't think that decision has to be to bring to the floor an idea that a bad idea just so it can have a vote.
Just quickly, because I want to go to questions. Do you have a thought on that?
If every issue that we dealt with in Albany had 5 days of 10-hour hearings before we voted on it, I would be a lot happier. But that's not the way things get done. And what ends up happening is, the devil's always in the details. So someone can say, well, you should pass a bill that says we hereby outlaw the death penalty. Okay, but then someone tries to amend it, and then the lobbyists come. The lobbyists with their money descend upon Albany and say, while you're doing that, why don't you add this or add that, or why don't you open a new jail in my county? And then lo and behold, what started as a very simple process, which is should we reinstate or should we not reinstate, becomes confused intentionally by people into other things. And that makes the process very, very complicated. And so after 5 days of listening to New Yorkers and hearing that 90% of the time is people vehemently opposed to it, I see no reason why we as a body should be forced to go to relive all that and then relive the reality of what the legislative process is, which is people with power and influence trying to influence us one way or the other.
You want to jump into this very briefly?
I don't think every issue obviously can be voted on. I do think an issue like the death penalty, I don't know, I didn't get a chance to see a lot of those hearings.
We had fun. You should have come.
I know, it sounds wonderfully robust. But I do think that for the past several years, there are so many issues that never see the light of the day. And what was so frustrating is that they frequently die in committees that weren't meeting. And frequently in rules, which now has to meet and is more out in the open. So you just want to know how something starts, where it goes, and if it does die, why it dies. And so that's the kind of thing that needs to be public.
Tell us your name and the campus you're from, please.
I am Jason Schaff from Brooklyn College. In California, Governor Schwarzenegger has proposed that courts determine the redistricting in legislatures preventing states like Texas and this one from using redistricting or gerrymandering, as the case may be, to gain seats, basically eliminating power of the other party. Should New York adopt this and California adopt this policy?
I don't think so. It scares me when people say, here's a law that's so important that elected representatives shouldn't be allowed to vote on it. I think there are ways we could improve our redistricting process and get proposals developed and out there that are less partisan influenced. But ultimately, I think it makes sense that a law as important as redistricting go through the lawmaking process. You could carve up, Manhattan or any place else in a variety of interesting ways, all of which could have some level of justification, but would result in wrenching apart communities from elected officials that they have gotten to know and have gotten to know them, and relationships between adjoining neighborhoods that have developed relationships over years. And to some panel of experts, your new redistricting plan might make a lot of sense, except to the people who live in that community, it would be a nightmare.
Danny, I want to bring
I've supported legislation that would change the redistricting process in New York. Sandy Galiff had a bill, our colleague Mike Gineris had a bill. I supported both of those bills to remove some of the politics. I find it somewhat ironic that Governor Schwarzenegger would now wake up to this and to view that courts are above politics. Please remember, judges are appointed by politicians, and that we have Court of Appeals, decisions up the wazoo, which have lots of things in them that people would wonder about because of who those judges are. So judges are not some impure, imperfect, apolitical animals. They are people who often are big funders. They're often people big checks. They often come from very large law firms who have very specific political leanings, and then they ascend to the bench. And so the bench is not this pure place where people think, that's where, the good thinkers go.
It's not Mount Olympus?
No, it is not. It is not Mount Olympus. And so obviously redistricting needs to occur in a somewhat different fashion. So I've supported that work. I, at this point, would not support relying on the courts for the reasons I just explained.
And if you remember your Greek mythology, you might not want Mount Olympus in charge of this either.
Well, Common Cause stood with Governor Schwarzenegger at the national level on this plan and has taken a lot of heat from our members for it, because our members don't particularly like Governor Schwarzenegger and are leery of him. But we do support, in New York, we've been working on a plan to have an independent, nonpartisan redistricting commission. Then they give the plan to the legislature, and the legislature does have the power to make some amendments. But somewhere, somehow, you have to be a little bit more blind to the way the districts are being drawn now and how completely political it is now. I mean, there is the Voting Rights Act. This is a complex, important issue. But there's no doubt right now that it's done, by both parties agreeing to keep their houses intact. And occasionally houses shoot themselves in the foot. I mean, the Senate, interestingly, trying to make sure that the Villela seat, when Villela went to jail on bribery charges, was still safe for Republicans, took seats away from Spano in Westchester, took people away. And then he almost lost his seat, in part because of the redistricting there. So it's just interesting. I mean, it's not easy, but independent is better than a purely partisan redistricting that again picks voters before you get to pick your lawmakers.
If independent means just mathematical, I think you'd have, I would argue against it. But I think that the Villela-Spano situation, where you kind of try to pack Republicans into one district to save somebody, has an impact in an adjoining district, is kind of indicative of the Republicans' problem with the state Senate, where now they only have, a 4 or 5 seat majority in a state which is essentially a Democratic state.
Right.
And if arguably, if you had this kind of independent redistricting, you would be much more likely to have a Democratic state Senent.
That's true.
Than you do now. Let me go to another question, please.
My name is Scott Stewart, and I attend Manhattan Community College. Recently, I was reading about something called housekeeping committees, and that they allow, basically they're money laundering processes, and they allow unlimited amounts of corporate money to be funneled in.
This is within the political parties.
Exactly. Allowing basically money to be shifted from one account to the other, allowing big business to funnel money into campaigns. What effect does that have on the legislative process, and is there any efforts being made towards eliminating it?
Knowing Rachel Leon, that is what's called a fastball down the middle.
So we believe housekeeping accounts are one of the disgraces of the New York State, campaign finance system. We banned soft money at the federal level. It was a bipartisan effort. McCain, Feingold, Shays, and me, and the public really got behind this. Soft money is basically money that's supposed to be used to build parties, but has been used on elections for election purposes. It's basically just a way to get around contribution limits. It's abused in New York. It should just be gotten rid of. They should match the federal ban, and Connecticut has banned it, so we should just get rid of it.
Yeah, I would agree. And in fact,
And the Assembly has.
there are loopholes in our campaign finance system that actually sometimes amaze me that they haven't been more abused than they are. And no, I won't tell you what they are because people are watching. But give people bad ideas. And yes, we ought to try to control soft money and the like. I think the most important thing that we could do to reform and improve the political process would be to adopt at the state level what New York City has adopted, which is the matching campaign finance system. And actually, New York City's law is modeled on a bill that began passing the Assembly in 1979, and the city has improved on it. That doesn't stop big money from having an influence in politics. I don't know that the mind of humanity can figure out a way to stop big money from being influential in our society. What it does do, though, is enable a candidate who does not have big money or access to big money to still raise enough money to mount a campaign and get a message out and get elected. And that has made an enormous difference in the city council, and I think it would have an earth-shaking beneficial effect on the state legislature.
It also brings sunshine. Even where you have larger contributions, you have to report them, and sunshine remains the best disinfectant on these kinds of questions.
Well, sunshine's not as good as money.
Well, but if you put the money in, you can see it in the sunshine.
But a candidate who doesn't have access to money can get that access to be able to mount the campaign under the city's campaign finance law, and we really ought to do that in Albany.
Look, if you have a governor like we do who sets up an account in Virginia where the laws are different and then takes hundreds of thousands of dollars from state interest, which he's not required to report, the system is broken. So the reality is that we need to change a lot of these things, and we need to make sure that there is sunshine so that the voters of New York get to know this is who the people are who are giving money to them. And so we now have a new bill pending in the Assembly that would allow that sort of out-of-state, use of out-of-state campaign laws. But, like Dick said, there are always these loopholes. Creative lawyers, creative people will find the loopholes. We just have to keep on trying to plug them.
Yes, sir.
I'm Jordan Mazzella. I'm from Brooklyn College. Now I have a question about the legislature, which I feel has, in the last few years anyway, a pretty definite stranglehold on the executive branch in this state. I think it's one of the anomalous things about this state. And I want to know, as far as this particular governor goes, how you guys feel about his power control and whether he has it or not.
You're saying you think we have a stranglehold on the governor?
Oh yeah. I mean, in terms of his proposals he's passed and the
well, you did pass a budget over his veto.
And the veto and consistent overrides. I mean, I'm talking about that.
We overrode the governor's budget vetoes 1 year in 03. I think the reality is, and unfortunately so, that New York State has an enormously powerful governor. I don't know how it compares with every other state, but and the governor's power has recently been enormously increased by the State Court of Appeals in their decision on the budget process that has given the governor almost dictatorial power over the budget, unless the legislature, as the Court of Appeals said, we have the power to just refuse to adopt a budget, create gridlock, and somehow force him to negotiate. That's not a particularly attractive way to run a government. But without that tool of gridlock, the legislature has virtually no power against the governor at this point in the budget.
I think that's what's interesting. That's what it's come down to now. It is a power struggle right now between the legislature and the governor. And I'm concerned this session because I do think this is a session where reform is being talked about, but we have to figure this one out because at this point it is, it's a game of chicken that nobody wins. I mean, the governor, I think that the legislature does feel in this recent court appeal that the governor has a lot of power. So we supported the budget reform efforts last year where the Assembly and Senate came together and passed a package that would restore a little bit of the power back to the legislature and at least allow them to create their own budget and do amending of budgets if they couldn't reach a consensus with the governor. But now the Senate really dropped the ball on that one, and so we're back to square one. And this is really tough, and this is what all the underlying battle or the very upfront battle is this year. So I don't know how it gets resolved.
One of the political facts of life is that in the Assembly, having, 104 to 46 Democrats versus Republicans, there's no chance unless, the earth, there's an upheaval in the earth, that the Republicans are going to take control of the chamber. Mr. Bruno, who is the Senate Majority Leader, has to watch his back and has to figure out a way to hold on to his Republican majority, which is severely endangered. And he has kind of been in opposition to the governor a lot more than you might think a Republican governor and a Republican Majority Leader would be, because he has an independent political interest. And I think it's one of those examples, as a New Yorker, as a city person, who thinks that I think that there's a degree to which gridlock is good for the city. It stops bad things from happening at times. But I mean, there's an example where politics is kind of reining in what the governor can get done because of because Bruno has local politics. All politics is local. His local politics being within his chamber.
Well, the first thing he has to do is keep his members alive, because they're old. There's a bunch of old white men in the state Senate, and that's part of the problem here. Is if he loses one or two, those districts in a fair election could in fact become Democratic districts. So Joe Bruno has to constantly be aware of that dynamic. Secondly, the power base for the Republicans in the Senate comes from the suburbs and upstate. And so then you get these districts on Long Island, Westchester, where some of the issues are more closely aligned to the city in reality than in fact the larger Republican agenda, certainly the nationwide Republican agenda or the agenda of a governor who intends to run for president. And so it becomes a balancing act. When it comes to the budgetary issues, these are all college students. And if we as elected representatives think that the governor does not give adequate resources to the colleges or to student loans, we are supposed to be able to fix that. That's what people really sent us to do. And so until that process gets resolved, I think Rachel's entirely correct. We're going to be in this gridlock situation. But Joe Bruno has a different political reality and a different political problem, which is that even some of his members do not reflect the agenda of the governor.
Yes, sir.
Yes. My name is Reuven Levavi from Brooklyn College. My question's
Brooklyn
for
College is well
Rachel
represented.
Leon. Yes,
Brooklyn
we're doing well
College,
for you tonight.
Yes.
As Bob Liff said, I too believe sunshine is a great disinfectant, but getting CSpan type program, I believe, may not be useful. It is successful in Washington because people actually care to watch CSpan and they care about national politics. I believe the real question is, how do we deal with the apathy that faces New York City politics, and how is Common Cause using their resources to fight that apathy?
Just one point. Pace University just came out with a poll in which people basically did not care about the issue of legislative reform. It's a very good point.
It's a very good point. And Common Cause spends a lot of time when it's not lobbying in Albany, trying to get more people involved, in civic participation, trying to get people to vote. One of the big things we're lobbying for in Albany is same-day registration, because we know that states that have same-day registration have much higher turnout in elections, and a lot of it is young people. And they think about it late. They want to do things. This is an instantaneous generation. You're not used to having to think about things a month in advance. You make your plans the day before or the day of. And so we believe same-day voter registration and making Election Day a holiday would get people more excited and more involved. I mean, during the presidential election this fall, 2 of the debates happened after New York deadline had already passed. So if you got inspired by one of the final debates of the presidential election, it was too late. And so we spend a lot of time, we also spend time in high schools trying to tell people why this stuff matters. And I think if there was a C-SPAN and it was hearings on the death penalty, and or debates on the death penalty, and it was debates on how we're going to fund our schools and what's going to happen with mass transit and college stuff, I think people would be interested in that.
By the way, you know, in the 1970s, and you don't want a whole legislative body filled with people who've been there as long as I have, but having one or two of us just to remember is useful.
Institutional memory is critical.
In the 1970s, the New York City NBC channel had a crew in the Assembly chamber practically every day that we were in session, and film that they took was on the 6 o'clock news of what we were doing in the Assembly. The New York Times, every morning after we were in session, had a story about the debate on the floor in the Assembly and Senate, had a story in which they rattled off at the end a dozen or so bills that had passed the Assembly and the Senate, and what the bill did and what the debate was about. That information was out there and people paid attention. For whatever reasons, the New York Times decided that news wasn't fit to print anymore, and the camera crews disappeared. And you know, the other day, the New York Times had a story about an Assembly committee considering an expansion of the bottle bill, and how amazing it was that people didn't know the outcome before the vote, and there were people who were talking at the meeting and actually changing their minds and thinking, as if this was some earth-shaking event. Now, to New York Times readers, it was an earth-shaking event because they had never read about such a thing before. But it goes on every week that we're in session in Albany, at any number of committee meetings at which there is real discussion about bills. I chair a major committee. Practically at every other meeting of my committee, I have a bill that I'm strongly in favor of that my colleagues on the committee say, Dick, you know, not this week, and the bill goes down. It happens all the time. The New York Times doesn't tell anybody about it, and therefore the New York Times can tell people it doesn't happen.
Well, as a reporter who, for 21 years, who's no longer a reporter, beating up the press is fine with me. Yes.
Hi, my name is Eni Chowdhury, and I'm from Brooklyn College. A question many frustrated New Yorkers ask is whether there should be term limits for some of these legislators.
Of course, I believe there's term limits every election day, but jump in.
I have never supported term limits imposed from the outside. I think elections are what term limits should be. And the real problem has to do with money and the corruption of money. And so if we had a campaign finance system, if we allowed people to have opponents who could actually raise the money to do this, that would make what it is. So when I never supported them. Even before I was elected, I did not support the city council term limits. You know, unfortunately, we have them in the city council and they create their own problems. I would love for people to be able to sort of go out there and say, hey, I have an idea. I don't think that this individual, for example, no longer reflects the community that he or she represents, and have someone say, hey, I'm 26, I'm new, I'm young, I live in this neighborhood, I think something different, and let the people decide through that process. That process gets shut off by the money in politics, and that's the way I think we should address the problem.
Amen.
We don't support term limits, and the Common Cause board and membership has always felt it should be through elections. However, I will put a but on there, which is that we are watching an interesting experiment in the city, and both the combination of really strong and good campaign finance laws, which is what we need in Albany as much as anything else, and term limits did lead to extremely competitive races and all sorts of, you know, interesting things. So right now you're watching an experiment in New York City where term limits are unfolding. And, you know, if we can get fair redistricting and campaign finance reform, I say we definitely don't need term limits. 10 years from now, if I'm still sitting here, Common Cause just might change its position.
Yes, sir.
Good evening. My name is Sohail Tazari. I'm from Queens College. My question is whether the panel would be in favor of a parliamentary system, just as a way to have more accountability as opposed to the finger pointing and gridlock we have now.
Do we get to have a queen? Or no, I'm sorry. Anybody want to?
Well, I mean,
be prime minister?
No, I don't want to be prime minister. I think it's an interesting question. I think that there are good and bad points of both of those systems. One of the problems with those systems is, you know, you have these backbenchers, you have a seniority system in a lot of ways that's really entrenched. At some level here, in our current system, any assembly member who has talent and ability can make themselves known on an issue or a subject, and that's not as tightly controlled. And so I think that there could be some healthy movement more towards that system in terms of the way they are. But in the end, I think American voters like the way this is. They like to elect, an
executive.
Directly. They like the direct election. Although these days with our current governor, I wish that the assembly members chose who the governor was rather than the people of the state of New York.
The idea of me being the health minister instead of chairman of the health committee is kind of entertaining, but I think in reality we are, I think, better served by the fact that there's a health committee chair in each house and a health commissioner who reports to the governor.
You just don't want to be criticized as you go after the state health commissioner.
Right. A few years ago I was talking with a legislator from one of the Canadian provinces, and this is when we were just beginning to have late budgets, and he said, the way we adopt the budget in Ontario is that, on the morning of the presentation of the budget, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, whatever it's called, presents the budget, and we would adopt it in the afternoon, and then in the evening we have a cocktail party to celebrate. Very efficient. I don't know if it's...
Well, Albany has the cocktail parties. They just skip that middle. They just skip that middle
I don't know
step.
if it's a good process, though.
Yes, sir.
Good evening. My name is Ryan. I'm also from Brooklyn College. My question is first to the State Assemblyman and then to you, Ms. Leon and Mr. Liff. A lot of students go up to Albany to lobby for change and to try and help CUNY especially, and not many of them get feedback about their efforts and what was effective and what wasn't effective. As State Assemblyman, I'm sure you've had this incident now where students have come to your office, they've talked to you about issues. What have you found to be effective in their efforts? And Mr. Liff and Ms. Leon, as lobbyists yourself, what would you propose for students to take on as different actions they could use when they go to the offices and they're trying to attract the attention of the assemblyman and get their support?
The one interesting thing about that, as a fairly new member, individual citizenry in numbers, volume, really make a difference. When you can't get on the elevators because the building has been taken over by the students who are complaining about TAP, that is really effective. They all have their stickers on that say, "Where's my TAP?" And so every legislator, every senator sees those kids in the elevator, in the hallways, in the bathroom. It makes a huge difference. Now, how does it make a difference? Does it change my priorities? No. My priorities have always been, that is one of the top priorities. It's what I got elected on. It's what I believe in. So that's not so much the issue. But the question is, when we figure out where and how to balance out those interests, their presence makes a difference. And as soon as constituents stop coming and filling those halls, then their interests don't matter. And so I encourage students to come. And when they come to my office, they often say to me, "The government took away my TAP." And I say, "No. Who took away your TAP?" And until they say, "Governor Pataki took away my TAP," I won't talk to them. And the minute they say that I say, "All right, then how do we solve this problem?" And so presence means everything in this business, because in the end, all we do and all we're allowed to do is compromise. And so the loudest wheel, the squeakiest wheel gets the oil, works in Albany. So if you show up, you're in the hallways, you crowd the elevators, we all know you're there, your interests are then moved higher up in the priority scale.
And also, we're human like anybody else. If we get the impression that the cuts can't be that bad because the students aren't complaining, well, then we'll worry about something else.
And I think a couple more things too. I think numbers do matter. So I think if you're going up on buses to Albany, that's exactly what you should be doing. You should keep going, and you should get your friends to go with you. But you should register to vote. Because what lawmakers do look at, they look at who's a constituent, who's in their district. So you should be visiting representatives that actually represent you, and you should register to vote, because they do check to see who are registered voters. And while they're supposed to listen to everyone, I used to represent kids who couldn't register to vote. And I tell you, it makes a difference. Now that I represent Common Cause members who vote like crazy, I get listened to a lot more than when I used to represent really cute kids who had a lot of needs. And so you want to make a difference, you want to be heard, you vote, you show up in Albany, and then you show up in their home district, and oh my God, what would that mean? If you actually had students not just coming to Albany, but coming to you guys in your districts about these issues, most people do not engage at all, and so engagement, it does make a difference.
You are lobbied all the time up in Albany on good government issues, on corporate issues, on large projects. What do you listen to? You're talking about if all these people come and yell at you, then there's a political implication, that there's some heft, that there's numbers. Maybe it could hurt you at the polls. Or something. What kind of advice would you give to lobbyists besides leaving you alone?
Never leave us alone. God knows what would happen. But I think the most important thing is information, because on on an enormous number of issues, legislators are basically free to be for and against whatever strikes their minds as being important. And the most important thing I think a paid lobbyist, a citizen advocate, whatever, can do is inform legislators, give us good arguments, explain to us as ordinary human beings why we ought to care about what you care about and why we ought to agree with you. I think keeping your message simple and clear and knowing well before you get to talk to us exactly what message you want to get across is a lot more important than most people might think. Giving us the impression that you think we will respond to arguments as opposed to not having enough respect for your own argument to think that you've got to, threaten us and try to bully us, I think is important.
What's effective in lobbying you? I mean, is it numbers? Is it making alliances?
You know
We just
what?
have
My
about 45
staff
seconds.
they're going to kill me when I say this. Emails. Because the truth is that if I get 2,000 emails in a week on one subject, when that subject comes up for discussion, I stand up and say, do you know I got 2,000 emails about TAP? So we better do something about TAP because we have 2,000 emails. There are a lot of issues that people come to me and say to me, this issue is resonating throughout your district. And then I turn to them and say, I've gotten 4 letters and I've gotten 300 about the electrocution of minks. It's amazing to me that if you don't communicate, you don't give us the weapons. So send us emails because I can set up a conference and say, 2,000 emails, got to do something.
Let me. I just got the goodbye sign, and I always make deadline. I want to thank you all. I think this issue of legislative reform is going to be with us for many, many sessions to come. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.